statue was here, and it had a fence around it. See these poles here? There's a real fence around it. And the town came down and checked her often. And then the kids started throwing rocks. They'd take rocks to the railroad track over there and throw it ahead. The town, they don't really want to, fool with this because it's a problem. Because the more they get upset if the kids throw rocks, the more rocks that will be thrown. Right? What? You agree? The toes and the nose. But lately, kids haven't been doing anything like that. But the fence was around it. And, her nose is broken. They repaired her hatchet. Her hatchet was broken.
So this is your statue?
Yeah. Oh, jeepers.
Every town has a past, and sometimes that past is dark and violent. Haverhill, Massachusetts is a city full of history, but one local woman's past, to this day, remains a controversy. Her name was Hannah Dustin. The city of Haverhill was established in 1640. It borders New Hampshire and sits along the Merrimack River and remains one of the oldest historic communities in Massachusetts. It was a leader of the shoemaking industry for 180 years, and many of those shoe mill buildings are now converted into restaurants, bars, and apartments. The city preserves its look, but remains progressive. One of the more curious attractions is Winnie Kinney Castle, built by chemist Dr. James R. Nichols in 1875. It is named after the Algonquin word for very beautiful. The castle is one example of a history deep in Native American culture.
Well, Haverhill, like all settlements in the Massachusetts Bay Colony, was an agrarian society. There was a village, and within the village were a number of so-called proprietors. They were the earliest settlers of Haverhill, and they claimed a certain advantage over the lands and common lands. But in addition, there were newer settlers, newcomers, and many of those lived east and west of the village, sometimes several miles away.
Haverhill is accessed by way of the Merrimack, and was no stranger to the violent times of the King William's War, where many local Native American tribes fought back against the English settlers.
Well, the King William's War was basically the Indian uprisings, and there were several Indian uprisings. The most famous was probably King Philip's. King Philip was not a king; he was an Indian. But related to that was the King William's War. These are basically raids of Indians who saw the white settlers as encroaching upon their ancestral and rightful lands. Well, raids would come indiscriminately and without warning. In Canada, the Indians were being egged on, so to speak, by the French, who thought that this would be an interesting way to antagonize their arch enemies, the English. Bands of Indians would appear out of the woods without warning. They'd attack whoever was in their way. They would burn down homes and houses, burn fields, and oftentimes kidnap and take away prisoners, mostly women and children.
Women were captured and brought north, where a number of scenarios played out.
Sometimes they were incorporated into the village as squaws, if you will, who were expected to do work. Most often they were taken to Canada and they were sold to the French. A woman or child's family was industrious enough, they would follow them to Canada and oftentimes could buy their freedom and bring them home.
And other times, the women left willingly.
Well, you have to remember, this is 17th century America. This was basically a wilderness. It was not a fun place to live, in my opinion. These women not only had to take care of the children and give birth to children, rear the children, they had to clean the house, they had to take care of the animals most often. If their husbands went away to war or on extended hunting expeditions, they had to run the farm. They had to make sure that the crops were taken care of, the fields were hayed. It was not an easy life. And we know anecdotally and through some documented reports, there were many women who welcomed the opportunity to be kidnapped and taken away from what was a very hard existence and swept off among the Native Americans or into Canada.
On March 15th, 1697, when members of the Abenaki tribe raided Haverhill, they killed 27 villagers and took 13 prisoners. One of those prisoners was Hannah Bradley.
She was taken to Quebec, I believe, Quebec or Montreal, and bartered away to a French family who actually treated her with kindness. Her husband tracked her down and went by foot all the way to Canada and paid for her release.
The Abenaki also captured Hannah Dustin, which later they would come to regret.
She was living in the West Parish with her husband, Thomas Dustin. Thomas was a highly regarded man of Haverhill, a farmer, and together they had, I think it was 9 children. On one fateful afternoon, as Thomas was working in his field, he spied something, a group of individuals slinking out of the woods. When he got close enough, he could see that the individuals were wearing war paint. They were Indians bent on a raid. Thomas saddled his horse, jumped on his horse, I should say, probably didn't have a saddle, got on his horse and rushed to try and save his family. He was able to gather up 8 of his children and lead them to a safe house nearby, a garrison, that's what that would be. However, he did not have time to save his wife, Hannah, her nurse, Mary Neff, and their infant child.
Hannah, 39, along with her day-old infant and nurse Mary Neff, were apprehended by the tribe.
They hadn't gone too far when they went through an apple orchard, and one of the Indians picked up the infant child and smashed its head against the tree.
It was common practice for the tribes to kill an infant or small child, since taking them on their journey would only slow them down.
Now you can imagine, if you're a mother, the effect that this would have on you, to see your child being brutally murdered by what they called in those days the savages. That's debatable as to whether or not they were savages. This was their land, and this was their native and cultural home, and these people are encroaching upon it. Nonetheless, it was a brutal world out there, and this heinous activity took place.
The tribe led Hannah, Mary Neff, and 14-year-old Samuel Leonardson of Worcester, Massachusetts, in a forced march north. Leonardson had lived with the tribe for nearly 2 years, and by now had learned their language.
And eventually they came to a small island in the Merrimack and what is now Pennacook, New Hampshire.
Pennacook is a small village within Concord, New Hampshire, and shares the northern border with Boscawen. It lies along the Contoocook River, which eventually joins the Merrimack. The party stopped at an island for a few nights before moving on to Canada. It is unclear as to what exactly occurred on those days on the island, but according to Cotton Mather, whom Hannah would later relay her story to, claimed the captors were threatened to run a gauntlet fully naked.
This was a stop on the way before they would perhaps split them up or perhaps take them on to Canada. That is not known.
But on the evening of March 30th, led by Hannah, an escape plan would be devised.
The Indian braves, the men, were away. Hannah and the boy and Mary Neff were left in the care of 2 old women, several children, and 2 old Indian men. In the middle of the night, Hannah awakened, and she got up and she grabbed a tomahawk and she killed all of the Indians who were her captors, save 2 who got away. Now, the Indians that she killed were 2 old men, 2 women, and several children.
6 children, to be exact. One was badly injured and managed to escape. Another, kept alive and intended to be their captive, also escaped.
They ran off to the river where there were war canoes. And before escaping, she turned around and went back because she realized that she wanted to have proof to the settlers when she returned that she had killed these Indians. And so she scalped them.
A knife, used as the scalping tool, is kept at Buttonwood's Museum at the Haverhill Historical Society. Also on display, a hatchet, the alleged murder weapon.
Put the scalps into a cotton handkerchief, tied it up, and made her way down to the river, into the canoes. They damaged and sunk the remaining canoes, and they went downriver to make their escape. Most likely, if she had just left, one of the Indians would have awakened at some point in time and sounded the alarm, and they would not have had the head start that they had by inflicting the mortal damage that they did.
Another debated fact is what Hannah's motivation was in returning to retrieve the scalps.
Why did she go back to get the scalps? Why didn't she just jump in a canoe and head down river and get out of there as fast as she could? Well, there are many theories on that. There were bounties that were offered. And in fact, Hannah and Mary Neff received a considerable reward for the scalps that they turned in.
The captors were paid £50 for the scalps upon their return. £25 to Hannah, £12, 10 shillings to Mary Neff. Leonardson, only 10 shillings. But some believe in a different motive.
Could it have been revenge? A mother's revenge runs deep. She had witnessed these Indians brutally kill her infant child. She was mad. She wanted to get revenge, and this was one way to get it, to get retribution.
Was she a hero or murderer? It is a question that will linger for a long time to come.
That's a tremendous act of brutality, if you will, to have committed. Yet none of us can say that we would not have committed the same act if we were living in the 17th century under the same circumstances of constant threat and fear of Indians who would come in, raid, loot, pillage, kill, and kidnap you and your family and your fellow villagers. Down through the years, however, everyone from Hawthorne to Thoreau to John Greenleaf Whittier have debated Hannah Dustin and her actions and whether or not this was an act of heroism or a criminal act.
Hannah Dustin lived nearly another 40 years in Haverhill, but little is known about her former years. However, there is no question she was revered.
Let it be said that she certainly was admired by the people in the village, and so much so that 200 years later, 150 years later, I suspect, a statue was erected to her in what is now GAR Park. And at the time, that was the first statue ever erected in honor of a North American woman. A second statue was erected at that island in Pennacook, New Hampshire, which stands there today. And to this day, Hannah Dustin is the only North American woman to have 2 statues erected in her honor.
The Dustin Garrison House, where Hannah lived after her return, and the marker that sits where her canoe touched down in Haverhill are amongst a few other landmarks dedicated to the controversial figure. But despite the violent nature of the story, Hannah was a woman of early America.
The Dustin family was in what we now call the West Parish, Monument Street, near the new Haverhill High School. In that area, no one ever knew precisely where Hannah was buried or where her house was. But there was some historic research done, and the researchers of the day determined that most likely she lived in the area of Monument Street. And around the turn of the century, I think it was 1901, there was a great, enormous boulder that was extracted from down near the banks of the Merrimack River, where Hannah had made her successful return from captivity. That boulder was drawn by an enormous team of horses, draft horses, on the backside of a large wagon, and brought to the spot where it resides today. Hannah Dustin was a woman of her time, and that time was 17th century America, living literally in a wilderness, exposed to hostile Indians. And every day you lived your life and with the fear and knowledge that you might not make it through that day or that week. I think that Hannah Dustin should be memorialized. She should not be worshipped as a heroine. I don't think that she should be considered disgraced for the actions that she took. She should simply be observed and studied as a historic person of our community. This isn't a myth. This isn't Paul Bunyan. This was a real person who actually lived and went through these experiences and suffered the consequences and returned the consequences as well.